I want to welcome everybody to this special program called The Art of the Interview, in which we're going to talk to some of the best journalists in Colorado about how they get great interviews. The foundation of, I think, a lot of great journalism is ultimately getting people voices on whatever subject you're covering to tell you things. It's not just necessarily showing up in tweets or Facebook posts or something. It's actually talking to people. There's Shaul. So we've got an all-star lineup here, and I'll kind of go down the line and just introduce everybody just left to right on my screen. So Tina Griego with Colorado News Collaborative. Do you want to introduce yourself first?
I'm Tina Griego with Colorado News Collaborative, formerly Colorado Independent. Longtime journalist in the state, left for a little bit, back now, and we're embarking on a new adventure to help strengthen local news in Colorado through Collab. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Ryan Warner, you're next.
Hi, I'm Ryan Warner. I'm the senior host of Colorado Matters, which is the flagship daily interview program on CPR News. And a part of a growing organization. We just announced a collaboration with KRCC in Colorado Springs, so that brings the show to the Pikes Peak region in southern Colorado, and I'm here in our almost empty newsroom.
One of the few working out of a newsroom. I guess the need for the broadcast stuff is really important, so great to have you. Sam Tabachnik from the Denver Post, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sam from the Denver Post. I've been at the Post for about 2 years covering general assignment stories, breaking news. Previously spent time in DC and New Orleans.
Great. And Shaul Turner from KDVR Fox 31. Thanks for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Welcome, everyone, and it's good to be here with you all. I am with Fox 31 News in Denver and have worked in Atlanta and other markets where I've, over the years, I don't want to date myself now, but have done a lot of work in different fields, from consumer to medical to politics, all types of stuff. Right now, I'm doing a lot of problem solvers work, which involves a lot of interaction with a comprehensive group of people, a lot of topics, a lot of interests, a lot of need in the community, and it's very interesting.
Great, thank you so much. So I will start with you, Tina, so yes, you're first. You, I think, have a really long and great history of and just your journalism roots are really talking to people in underserved communities, maybe people who aren't traditionally reached by mainstream media. And you, for a long time, as a columnist in the Rocky and the Post, and of course now your work with Collab and really some of the stories you've done in recent years, particularly in communities maybe that we don't hear so much about. I'm curious what you find when you go into these places and your ability to meet people and get them to open up to you. Do you find that there's distrust with the news media and distrust with you? And how do you go about building that trust to get people from these communities to open up to you?
I'm glad you actually zeroed in on that, because when we talk about the art of the interview, there's obviously many kinds of interviews in many contexts. You're talking about, sometimes you're talking to people who are media savvy, and sometimes you're talking to someone who's never spoken to a reporter before. And that latter group tends to be the group that I'm most frequently coming in contact with. They've never been interviewed. They don't necessarily trust the media or reporters, and building trust. You know, if you've heard me speak about interviewing before, I will say that for me, a lot of the interview and a lot of the establishment of trust really begins with empathy. It is, for me, empathy, I read this someplace, and I've said this before, is empathy is the ultimate act of imagination. And so if you can empathize with the person that you're talking to. And again, this is a very specific kind of interview that I'm doing. They tend to be vulnerable people. They may be a parent whose child has been killed. They may be somebody who's struggling with alcoholism. They may be an unaccompanied minor. And so there may be trauma in the background. So to the degree that it is possible to imagine yourself in that person's place, that's always my starting place internally. In the act of preparation is to try to imagine myself, if I'm interviewing an unaccompanied minor, for example, to try to imagine what it must be like to leave your home, to cross a country, to go someplace where you have no idea what might happen. And that is a starting place for me in beginning to establish trust. There's more to say about that, but the other thing I would say is that when I am framing interviews, and this is something that I started doing as I became a more experienced reporter, when I'm framing interviews with people who have experienced trauma, it's a tricky thing, right? You don't want people to relive their trauma. You don't want to be exploitative. You don't want to extract in such a way that is further damaging. So I almost always let people that I am interviewing know that this is their story, and they have a right to their story, and they have a right to tell me at any moment that they don't want to talk about that right now, or they're not comfortable with that line of question. And then I will back off and then see how the interview proceeds. But I found just saying the words aloud to somebody that you're interviewing, that they have a right to their own story, can be a very powerful way to establish trust. And you have to honor it. So that's where I would begin.
Great, thanks. Shaul, I know that you had mentioned that you do a lot of problem solver stuff. Some of your recent stories, again, reaching out to people who have experienced trauma. I'm curious, you have to approach it maybe from a little different perspective because people are ultimately going on camera. And I'm wondering what sorts of challenges that brings when you're talking to people who have either experienced trauma, again, don't trust the media. How do you approach it?
Well, I so agree with the whole point about empathy. And we have these time constraints, but yet then there's the reality of the job, right? You got the time constraints. Perfect example, last Thursday night, we had a woman whose mother-in-law found sitting dead in a parking garage at the hospital for 3 days. Nobody noticed her. And they had to learn about their loved one's death like that. And they were outraged and they were feeling a range of emotions, as you can imagine. Now, reach out to us. That was my fourth story I chased that day. And we had so little time. I didn't even get to talk to her till 6:30 in the evening. The show comes on at 9. So you got this time constraint you're dealing with. Yes, you want them to go on camera. No, they've never gone on camera before. Yes, they don't trust the media. All those boxes are ticked. But the one thing that can make this work that I found in my experience is diving right in there and just telling it like it is. If that were my mother, I don't know what I would do. I know one thing, you reached out to us for a reason. What is that reason? They're dictating how, they have that power right there. And then from there, well, we want other people to know that this has happened and that we feel wronged. Okay, well then use us as a tool to do that. We're here for you. Where do we start? I think it's a matter of empathy and letting people know that we're not there to have power over them. We're here to help give them the power to use us as a tool to get the word out. And I think there's that balance there at that point.
Do you find that, just a quick follow-up, do you find that people recognizing you on television helps with, some of those trust issues because they've maybe seen your work before?
Yeah.
A little different if you're just, say, reading text, in a newspaper or on the web. I'm curious whether that plays in any of this as well.
Well, it adds another dimension. People may have seen things I've done before where I've helped people or, gotten help for people, which is basically what we're here for. So I have had situations where there's a producer I work with sometimes, and she will call and someone will decline. I don't want to be on TV. I don't want to be with the media. I don't want to. And then I will give them a call. Absolutely. When do you want me there? Because they just need a connection with a human being that they're familiar with. It's just kind of like a friend, you know, someone that they feel they can trust, who they've seen help other people. So why shouldn't they help them?
Great, thanks. Sam, before we got started, we were talking about some of your recent reporting on Elijah McClain and how you had to reach out to activists. And, you know, I imagine a lot of those people don't particularly trust the media, but, you know, to try to understand what they're protesting, what they're trying to change. How did you go about finding people? And was it really difficult to get people to open up to you? A big, you know, mainstream newspaper like the Denver Post, did you find challenges there, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, you know, I do think there is a kind of interesting phenomenon where people don't trust the media, but they are very willing to open up and talk to a person, you know, who happens to work for a newspaper, AKA the media, you know, and so I think there is kind of a larger narrative, and sometimes it's national versus local, you know, and I think that there have been studies, you know, showing that people trust local news more than national news. And so I do think, you know, I think in being a journalist, it can be frustrating when people talk about the media. I think in general, as a general sort of big picture, everybody falls under the same thing. But I think that once people start talking to you and they realize you're a human being and they realize you're, you know, you're asking interesting questions, a lot of people just want to be heard, you know, and I think in life, there aren't that many people who are willing to just sit down and listen to you, you know, for a while. And, you know, I think, you know, people pay for professionals to sit down and listen to them. But I think often people don't get asked how they feel, and they don't have someone who's just there to talk about them. They're not there to talk about themselves. And I think once people get going, I think it can be very, very cathartic for them.
Absolutely. Ryan, you know, you're kind of in this interesting position, perhaps out of all the panelists, in which everybody, tens of thousands of listeners, get to hear you actually interview your subjects. You know, there's, of course, I would imagine there's some editing, but they get to hear your questions and everything. And you talk to people, everybody from, you know, the governor to, you know, book authors, et cetera. I'm curious how you go about preparing for your interviews. You obviously have to react to the news, and so sometimes there's not quite some time, maybe not quite to the frantic pace that Shaul has to go through, but you know, it's still the news business. So I'm curious how you approach each of your guests, and do you approach guests differently depending on, you know, their position? Is the governor different from, say, somebody who, you know, was the victim of violence or trauma?
Well, I think that Tina said it really well, which is that you've got people who are experienced speaking to the press and those who aren't. So there is a difference in how you approach those conversations, because I speak to a fair number of people who preface when they walk into the studio, oh my gosh, I've never done radio before. I've never done this before. And I comfort them by saying, anytime you've spoken on the phone to a friend, you've done radio. And I think that's the intimacy of radio. It's the beauty of radio. I don't envy Shaul, who has to get people to open up, and they have to do it like in front of lights and camera. You know, I had a short television career, and I feel really lucky that we're a medium that is easily kind of out of the way. So I think we have that in our favor. Like it's just a microphone, and I think that's a lot less to deal with than if you have to be on camera. So I just so admire good television journalists for that reason. I think of interviewing as intimacy. This is not a phrase that I coined, but intimacy, instant intimacy. You have to develop a relationship with someone in a very short span of time and hope that they open their heart to you. So there are a lot of devices I use, especially if someone is nervous and is not used to the press. You know, we have to do a mic check, and instead of saying, "What did you have for lunch today?" I'll say, "What was your first car?" And this gets people to kind of go back into a pleasant memory, a little bit of nostalgia, and it takes them maybe out of their nervousness a bit. So yeah, there are ways in which I put on kid gloves with people who are not used to being, you know, in the media versus a Governor Polis where we can just jump right in because this is his, you know, 50th interview of the day. As for how I prepare for interviews, a hallmark of our show is the pre-interview. So 90% of guests you hear on Colorado Matters have been screened beforehand on the phone. This helps us understand if they're clear speakers, you know, if they're subject matter experts, can they explain that in an accessible way? And then when we have authors, you mentioned that I interview authors, we read the book. And that, it turns out reading the book helps when you're interviewing an author. And it's always amazing how often they exclaim with glee that we've read the material.
I hear this. I feel like I was listening to, like, I don't know if it was a recent Freakonomics podcast or something, just like a lot of, you know, people, like, they don't necessarily read the book. So you have to, like, you know, plow your way through 300 pages or something like that? Or do you all split it up? How do you approach that? Oh, okay. So so you're a voracious reader, it looks like.
I'm actually a terrible reader. I'm incredibly slow. I should never admit this as a public radio host, but I didn't really enjoy reading as a kid. I wasn't very good at it. I wasn't very fast. I've developed ways of reading well, and, you know, I hope incisively, but it's, you know, it takes work for me.
Thanks. And I just want to say, I see some questions coming through. We'll circle back to them. But to any of the attendees who are here, if you think of some questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll circle back to them. I want to make sure that we have time for your questions as well. I want to kind of open this up to anybody on the panel, but contentious or difficult interviews where you know that it might be an oppositional interview of some sort. You're challenging somebody. Again, everybody on, you know, every one of our panelists sort of has to approach that differently. Sam and Tina, you know, you're not necessarily being recorded for publication. Shaul and Ryan, quite different. How do you get over, I think, what is probably very natural for most humans, that generally speaking, I think most people want to be liked, right? That's something we enjoy, you know, and, but as a journalist, sometimes we have to ask, like, really hard questions. It's, I think, maybe the ultimate goal sometimes, again, not with every interviewer, but maybe it's a politician or somebody in public office or something, and you know, something's gone terribly wrong and you have to ask oppositional questions, or pointed questions, or really challenge somebody. You know, it might even be that you have to fact check in real time. We're seeing sort of the emergence of a lot of that. How do you maybe just personally sort of, like, I don't know if you have fears, but how do you, like, get over the fact that, like, all right, I'm going to have to ask some tough questions here, and perhaps, you know, perhaps people, you know, might not like me, or they'll cut off the interview, or they'll hang up. Curious how all of you approach that. So I'll just open it up to anybody who wants to jump in.
Well, I'll jump in. I think that what people, when they see us, yes, they do see us as another human being, but they also see us as a person doing a job, just like the milkman or anybody else. And yes, I'm dating myself again, but they see us as doing our job. So there are people, there are politicians, there are CEOs, there are people who I have worked with for so long, I have become friendly with them, but they know the next time they see me, I will be doing my job and asking the tough question if they go and do something that warrants that. But I think another example of that I can bring here is these dirty landlords, slumlords, people out there doing stuff like that. When we approach them to try to help the poor people who are dealing with what they are making, the conditions that they are made to live in, We know getting out of the news car that we are not going to be liked, that it could even potentially be dangerous. We've done our homework. We know exactly what's going on. We approach the person. Sometimes we have to go all the way to their house, their business, their other business, and their other business, and their other business, and chase them down. And all of that's put on the air. And the one that stands out in my memory is a terrible slumlord who we rolled up on, who had been making people live in terrible conditions. And he tried to grab my microphone. He cussed me out. We spent most of our time in editing, bleeping all of that out. And actually that night when I got home, I kind of put that extra bag of recycling in front of my front door that makes a lot of noise if anybody opens it. But, you know, those kind of things, I think, are really a matter of people realizing that we're here to do a job, to hold people accountable and to let the public know what's going on. So I think that's a two-way street, and that's understood. And if it's not understood, then that's not our issue, if that makes sense.
Yes, Shaul, thanks. Tina, Sam, or Ryan, oppositional interviews and how you approach them?
I'll jump in just because a recent oppositional interview became the subject of a political ad that's been running incessantly this election. So Senator Gardner was on the show, and we had a question for him about Obamacare and whether he supported dismantling Obamacare in the midst of a pandemic, whether the current situation had perhaps changed his view of the Affordable Care Act. And that was just an example of an interview where he didn't answer the question once, and so I asked again, and he misframed his opponent's position on the matter, so it was my role to make sure that the record was clear on what his opponent did or did not support. And then I went back and asked the question again. I think it was a total of 4 or 5 times, and I think you can do that and be respectful. I mean, my job there is simply to illuminate his position and not to badger. I don't see my role as, you know, badgerer in chief, but illuminator in chief. And at the end of 4 or 5 tries, if there is no answer, that is in and of itself illuminating. So, you know, I suppose that could be framed as oppositional, but I don't think that, I don't think things have to be ugly or antagonistic just because they're hard.
You have to, though, eventually sort of decide, like, you know, okay, like, clearly he's not going to answer this question. Like, when do you decide to sort of give up, I guess? Is it just like, well, you know, I've asked this 4 or 5 times, like, I'm not getting anywhere. Time to move on in this interview.
It's a great question, because in that case, it was, I think we only had 8 minutes with him, and it happened to be live. So it's a calculation. You know, my producer's chatting with me over a screen. I'm seeing the clock counting down. I'm listening to his answer. I'm trying to follow up. And it is a sense that, okay, well, this has now been asked a 4th or a 5th time, and I've got to move on to something else. But it's an immediate and unscientific calculation. A listener suggested after that interview a device. I have not used this. I'd be very interested if these kind fellow panelists would have a thought about this. She goes, if you don't get the answer to the question, say that you're just going to assume the answer is no. And then they can come in and say, well, no, I didn't say that. I've not used this device yet. I thought it was an interesting one as a suggestion.
Actually, I was curious about that. So I didn't hear that interview, but did you just move on, or did you say, okay, it's clear you're not going to answer that question, and then move on?
I think I did say that, Tina. I don't remember. I should go back to the transcript.
So I just want to echo that. I think it is possible to have those tougher interviews, those oppositional interviews, in a way that doesn't have to get ugly, and in a way, my demeanor already tends to be pretty level, and so I find that the more emotional or angry or irate the person I'm interviewing gets, the more I ratchet down in tone. but I think it's possible just to keep asking the question in a very direct way. Now, sometimes it can be hard. It can be hard not to feel that little blossom of, you know, your own frustration or aggravation because this person is just jerking you around. But I think, you know, it's a question, it's a way to ask the question that's very direct. You're not pulling any punches. You know, you're explaining the context for which you're asking that question. I find that sometimes that can be really helpful to explain when it's not immediately obvious what the context is, why you need to know this, why people need to know this, why this matters. And then of course the follow-up is just critical. It's just critical. And that's where it gets hard, because people will walk away, or people will hang up, or people will, you know, and so all of the things that we already know that are basics of interviewing, about doing your homework and all that, those become much more critical when you're doing an oppositional interview, because you have to be nimble.
There is a question from Noel that's sort of building off this, and Noel says, I hate it when people, especially politicians or authorities like police chiefs, answer questions with questions and try to deflect back on the interview. How do you respond to those? I'm sure you've never had that happen to you, any of you. So again, the question, when somebody who's probably used to speaking to the media, not always, but used to, answers questions with questions and tries to deflect back on you, the interview, how do you handle that?
I do think it is something that I've gotten before, especially the question, well, what do you think, comes back at me. And it's like, you know, this is now, you know, lawyers do it too. And they're like, so what do you think about this case? I mean, you know, and, you know, I don't know exactly what they're trying to do, but, you know, I think you try and kindly tell them it's not really about what I think, you know, like what I think is irrelevant. I'm talking to you to get your either opinion or factual information about either a certain case or a certain, you know, story that we're talking about. And, you know, it's not about what I think, and I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to give you my opinion on what you guys are doing or not doing.
I couldn't agree more. That's, and again, I think it comes right back to, and I understand that what I do with, you know, problem solvers and our brand, and a lot of the stuff I do is very different kind of ecosystem than what a lot of you are doing in the environment in which you are in. So I know that these examples might be kind of off this side of it, but I think the common denominator here is that, yeah, if you tell it like it is. I've had politicians say that to me before, and I've said, well, just lightheartedly, I'm the reporter, so I'm just here to ask the questions. So, but you're the one in front of the camera, so what do you think about that? And they usually, you know, give it a chuckle. All right, you know, I tried it, but all right, I'll just either answer or not answer and move on.
Ryan or Tina, anything to add to that? No. One of the things that I want to ask about too, I'll jump to sort of the beginning of the interview process. How do you explain ground rules ahead of time? Do you explain it? Do you go through the process of explaining, like, this is what off the record means, this is what on background is, this is, and sort of related to that, if you have a subject that says, I would like to go off the record, you know, do you just immediately flip your recorder off, or your audio collection device, or your camera? When a subject insists that they want to do that, they don't want to be recorded, you know, maybe explaining something, maybe it's for context, or they're not comfortable being on camera. Do you grant that right away? Just curious how each of you handles that. So Shaul, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You have to respect that, because that's linked to integrity and what you're doing as a professional. You have, if someone says, I don't want this to be on the air, the camera goes down. Oh, okay, we respect that. Another good reason is because when you look at a large size organization, okay, we have a central area where we put all of our video, for example. If that camera is still rolling, oh, well, we'll respect it. We just won't air it, but we'll just roll on it. That means one of the umpteen zillion other people in the system who have access to that video It could by mistake end up on the morning show. We run 2 channels under one roof, and we run several shows a day on each channel. Something's gonna happen. So you have to put those stop gaps in place. You have to have that insurance policy that this person's wishes will be respected and their privacy will be respected.
Tina?
Well, I do explain the ground rules, what certain things mean. If somebody does want to go off the record and they want the recorder off, because I do find that I record now more often than not, simply because my hand does not work the way that it used to work. That does not mean, though, that if I've gone off the record and I've stopped the recorder and then they say something that's really great, that I am not going to try like hell to go back and persuade them to go on the record with that. So I will honor it, but if it's really good, then I'm going to go back to it and try to persuade them to go on the record and why I think they should go on the record. And if that doesn't work, then who else might tell me the same thing? Who else has this information?
I just want to quickly follow up on that because I think it's just an interesting technical way that you go about it. So it sounds like you have both a recorder and a stenographer's notebook, and you're doing both at the same time. I'm assuming you learned shorthand at the that you still deploy. Is there a reason you like to do both? I think maybe a lot of journalists who are just starting out their careers are just like, you know what, I am just good with the recorder and that's just totally fine, which is great until the thing breaks or doesn't work. But I'm just curious how you approach just the technical aspects of it. Yeah.
So I didn't learn shorthand. I used to be able to write really, really fast, but anymore the reporter's notebook is in some ways a prop, right? And I've said this before, like the notebook can be both an invitation and a wall. And when I'm interviewing somebody, particularly when I'm interviewing them in person and I have the notebook out, it's kind of hard to explain, but there is a way in which your posture itself, if you're interviewing someone, it's very hard to do over Zoom, can't obviously do it over the phone, but if you're interviewing someone and you have this notebook and yeah, the recorder is writing, but they're not really paying attention, the recorder's writing, they aren't really paying attention to that, but they are paying attention to when you're writing and when you're not writing. And there's a way in which you can have a conversation with somebody and in person, before social distancing, when the reporter, your body, your shoulders, all of it is kind of almost creating a little bubble. It's just like, it is that intimacy. I like that term, right? It's like it creates a space that is just you and the person you're interviewing in this notebook and what is going in this notebook. And so, yes, I use the notebook. No, I no longer write verbatim in the notebook because I simply can't, but I will hit highlights in the notebook. But it is, I found a very effective tool, not just as a way to invite somebody in, but also even for me, it's comfort, it's familiar, it's okay, now I'm Tina doing my journalist thing right now, and it moves me into a space, and it can move them into a space. So
good.
Yeah, that was a long answer to that question.
No, that was great. Thank you. Sam, ground rules when people want to go off the record. And I'm really curious, especially if you're talking to people who maybe, again, just are new and don't really understand what those terms mean, how you sort of handle that when subjects want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, it varies widely between, some people who've maybe never talked to a reporter or a journalist before, and then, some other, officials or spokespeople who sort of know what they're doing, and maybe they are trying to play a little bit of a game with you. And I do think it can get tricky when some people, especially if their job is to be a spokesperson, and they don't want to go, they don't want to use their name, they don't want to go on the record, about something. And, I think sometimes you can't just agree right off the bat, hey, let's go off the record. Obviously there's the time and place for it, for different things, but I think it can get dicey if that becomes a norm, or that becomes most of the time, and I think that can get a little dangerous. So I think with people who sort of know what they're doing, it's a bit of a different conversation than with somebody who just, they don't know. There have been more times, I think, than I ever sort of thought, where I've spoken to people and they say, oh, this is going in the newspaper. And I'm like, what do you think I do here?
Hey,
yeah.
I've had that happen so many times. I've worked with somebody an entire day, Sam, and at the end of the day, with an hour left before the show, you mean this is going to be on TV? I don't want to do it then.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's like, I didn't trick you into who I am. I didn't say I was an accountant, like I said, I'm a reporter for the Denver Post, like I don't know exactly what they think I'm going to do. But yeah, so, sometimes, it is, giving people a chance to say, hey, like, especially in terms of, when they're talking about, maybe, things that have happened, tragic things, or, things that may have been, victims of crime of some sort. Some people, I think it is good to sort of ask them, what they're comfortable with.
Ryan, people can, I guess, in the middle of the interview with you, generally say, I want to go off the record. But, maybe I'm assuming you explain ground rules either ahead of time, or, or they might even say, like, I will answer all your questions, but you're not allowed to ask about this. Maybe they make a request like that. How do you handle that? Or maybe it doesn't come up.
It's not really a question for me, just because, when you agree to come on a talk show, it's like, you're kind of out there. This isn't a particularly fertile one for me.
Got it. Did somebody else want to add anything?
I'd love to answer John's question.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I was going to go there.
I'm like,
I was actually...
Stop playing host, Ryan.
No. I actually did want to jump to John's question. Sure, John, for those of you who haven't seen it or can't see it, John asks, what approaches do you use to break through a media-savvy subject's armor when they're sticking to talking points, but you want to get revealing answers? This is especially the case if you're doing a profile or some sort of biographical interview. So, Ryan, why don't we stick with you on that?
Well, to be able to answer John Murray's question, who I think is like one of the finest journalists, I just feel like this is the student trying to tell the teacher. But, for me, anecdotes, real life meetings with real people are ways to get, especially politicians, off their talking points. So if they're telling me some regurgitation of a policy, I'll say, can you tell me about a time you met with a voter and you heard this? Can you tell me how you came to your view on this? That's a really interesting way to get them beyond just the talking point. Tell me how you got there. Tell me what experiences in your own life got you there. Tell me what experiences of constituents got you there. And those tend to flesh out thinking a little better. And they'll reveal if the position that's held is actually only an inch deep. If they don't have the answers to that question, you start to wonder whether they're meaningfully held positions. The other thing I was going to say that I think ties into this to some extent is there are for me, two gauges of whether the conversation is getting to a good place. One is your guest using quotative speech? So it was told to me years ago that when we're really comfortable, we start mimicking dialogue. So it'll be like, and then she said, and I was all, and she's like, and then he was said, and then if you can get someone into that space in an interview, you've hit gold, because they've left the kind of self-conscious space, and they're so in the moment of that they're retelling that they're pretending to be the people that were in the room at that time. So I try to get people to that space. And then the other thing I try to do that could add perhaps a bit to what John has asked is 5 senses. So one way to get people out of talking points is, what did it smell like? What did it taste like? What did it feel like? What did it look like? And in radio, you know, it's been called theater of the mind. We have to kind of transport you somewhere virtually because we don't have images necessarily to throw onto the screen. So I think people don't ask about smell enough, and actually you'll get really interesting answers if you ask about smell.
Very good tips. So other answers to John's questions. What do you do to break through a media savvy subject's armor when they're sticking to talking points only? Sam?
Yeah. John, let me tell you a little something. No, I think one thing that I took from he's actually a basketball reporter, but he asks other people in that person's world, especially biographical stuff, if you're doing a feature kind of thing, he asks other people about stories that he should ask that subject, the person that they're writing about. And asking them, oh, you should ask them about this one time, or ask them about this thing that you would never know to ask about. And I think it's a really interesting thing that I've tried to do, and really poke around the people around them, because they'll often give you really good stuff that the subject may not actually ever want to bring up themselves.
I think that's a really good tip. I hate those interviews, John. Hate them. And I was interviewing Carrie Kennedy when she was running, and I try my damnedest. I like Carrie. I could not penetrate. And it was just like deflect. Part of it was her publisher, whatever her campaign person was sitting there. I'd always try to pry them apart when I'm doing something like that, you know. I was not successful in doing so. The other thing is that we met at a coffee shop. I mean, you know the old tricks, right? You know, you try to meet them on their territory if you can, because you're looking for visual clues in their surroundings that might give you some insight or some place that you can enter that doesn't have to do necessarily with the politics. But you know, they've kind of all become savvy to that, and that's really difficult to do, and especially really difficult to do now unless you're kind of peering into the background of their Zoom and you know, trying to figure out some way in like that. I agree with Ryan that how you came to, what were the experiences that led to, you know, I find that those, if you kind of really ask them to prioritize, if you're interviewing a candidate, for example, what is most urgent to them, and then get into the why, and then you could get into how other things connect to that. And then that might give you a way in. But yeah, those are really, really tough. They're tough in their own way.
Shaul, do you want to take that? Thanks.
Yeah, I can say, and again, just from a perspective of bringing in some other types of reporting here. I remember an interview I had with Jennifer Lopez once where, you know, a lot of the celebrity interviews, they always have at least 3 people swirling around, making sure you ask exactly what, you know, they want you to ask. And the way to get around a lot of that, and I think whether it's something like a J-Lo interview, or whether it is the local politician, or with problem solvers, dealing with people across the country who represent the CEO of UPS or some major company that has done something that has had a very bad effect on a person here in Denver, Colorado, who's just a regular person like the rest of us, is you state first, I know this fact, that fact, this fact, that fact, that they have already pre-canned that they want to say. Yes, we are aware of this, this, and this, but what about this? Or yes, I'm aware that this will be coming up and you're trying to shape the interview because you want to, you just list what they want you to list and then leave them with an alternative, something else to add, you know, something else that they can just say. Or with, okay, the example I gave you the other night of the poor family with the mom found dad in her car for 3 days in the parking garage. You walk up with 90% of these stories, they want to retell everything you've already talked with them about ahead of time, right? You just say, now we know all the facts. We know what time the car was, we know what time this happened. We know, no. But how do you feel about this? And Ryan, what you were saying, so important about the senses, even though we do have the pictures of the explosion or the burned out apartment, right? We still want to hear, what did it sound like? What did it smell like? Because that does lead, the next step is how it made them feel. And I'll just come out and say, we have all the facts, but I just want to know how you feel about this. And that's that punctuation in every story that we need to make it, resonate with people so people can feel what that person felt. We don't need somebody telling us it happened at 5 o'clock on parking level C. What we need is, how does this affect you? How does it feel? What did it smell like when the fire burned? When you heard the child scream and run, how did that resonate with you? And that's what really grips people and helps us do our job better because it grips us.
Thanks. As a reminder for everybody who is attending, feel free to just drop questions in. We've got a little less than 15 minutes left, so if you have any questions, just drop them into the chat now. I did want to, we've kind of addressed this around the edges a little bit, but how has our current political environment made your job harder, or has it made your job harder? And if people, sometimes what people will say to you in person is different from what they might email you, but have you had anybody just accuse you of saying, well, you're fake news, like I don't want to talk to you? And how do you handle that? I think that's probably something, again, the press has always had maybe an uneasy relationship for good reason with power, but I'm just curious how you respond to accusations that you're fake news, if you ever received that, and again, how the current political environment has it made your job harder? And I'll open that to anybody.
Well, I just got been talking for a long time, so you guys go ahead.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Listen, it's a change. Of course, there's always been tension between leaders and the press. That's not new. What is new and what is markedly changed is leaders who actively try and succeed in undermining the press. I feel like even in the Nixon years, there was an assumption that the press had a role, and you could, despise the role that they were fulfilling, but it just was understood as an institution. And I think that now that's less so, and that the president's words in particular certainly have power with everyday folk, with everyday voters. And so I do meet with quite a lot of skepticism from people. And I think in public radio, we have a particular reputation. And it is my source of pride and privilege that when someone says you're fake news, or you don't give this party a chance over that party, that all I tell them is that it feels good to hold power to account. And I don't care if that power has a D next to it or an R next to it. And I have 10 examples that I can point to that show that that's the case. Vigorous questions for Jared Polis, vigorous questions for Cory Gardner. And I just think, point to the work. If you hear that someone says you're fake news, ask them for an example of something they heard that they didn't think was fair. Often they don't have an example. Often they heard that interview, but they didn't catch the fact that the next day you had on the Democrat, and you can say, here's exactly what we did. I just think the ultimate antidote to this is to point to the work. And, we've changed minds as a result of it.
I think you'll often, just to sort of go off that, Ryan, a little, you'll have to say, well, the media doesn't cover this. Like, why should I talk to you? You never cover this. What's your response to those questions?
I just a couple of weeks ago got accused of that. Actually, I got accused of making the show too gay. That was an interesting thing. I recently came out as gay on Twitter. I've never actually I'm not in the closet, but I was never open about my sexuality. And I changed that. I said something on Twitter, and someone wrote in and said, "Why is the show always about gay people?" And why don't you cover? And then she had a list of 12 issues she thought we should cover. So I went back and I did a quick audit of the last month on the show. There was one mention of gay people. There was one story about gay people. And then we had done about 12 of the 15 recommendations that she'd sent. So I replied with the facts, with the record, with our track record. And she was lovely. She wrote back basically tail between the legs and said, "I'm really sorry. Thank you for taking the time." So I always point back to the work.
I think it's one of the big challenges, like we're just so inundated with news and information, and just that this news cycle is so chaotic. There's so many places where people can get news that, very often it's like, oh, I didn't see this because my preferred channel of consumption, or I didn't see it on Facebook, or maybe perhaps worse, I did see this on Facebook, and this is what I think. Thanks for that, Ryan. So yeah, just to open that question up to others on the panel.
Well, I think that a lot of people say, why don't you cover this, when they actually heard about that thing from us or someone else in local news. Sometimes people even retweet something and say, why wasn't this covered, when it's literally being covered in the tweet that they retweeted. Sometimes people just read the headline or the lead and they don't read the story, and their answer is actually further down in the story, 3 paragraphs down. I think it can be very hard sometimes to go back and rationalize some of the things that are being accused. I think some people don't necessarily either want to give us credit, or there's a conspiracy going on that everyone's banding together to not cover something when in reality they are covering it. So I think it's an accusation that often gets thrown out there kind of with little, kind of evidence behind it.
I'm not doing this in the day-to-day so much anymore, as we're transitioning, and so I'm not out. I will say that I have some good practice of this with my own family members, right? I mean, I have a cousin who texts me and tell me that he thinks Pizzagate is real, and and so what I have learned is that there are people who respond, as the listener did with Ryan, who will respond graciously when you can do a quick, like, look, it was covered here, here, and here, or I'm here now, I'm listening now. But it's pretty easy to tell when people are arguing in bad faith, and I don't waste any time anymore. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole with somebody who's simply not arguing in good faith. So
thanks. Shaul, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I totally agree with Tina. I can give you a really good example during the protests downtown, where a young man approached me and my photographer as we were walking in the center of the protest all through downtown to cover it. And this was at a time when the protests were quite peaceful, and we were showing we were there to just tell it like it is. We were showing what was going on. And this young man approached the photographer I'm working with and is like, well, how come you don't show this? Why don't you show the peaceful part of the protest? So I explained to the young man, I said, well, that's why we're here. We're showing what's happening right now, what's happening tonight. And we are doing a story on what's happening. And he ignored me and said, well, if you won't show it, then I will, and whipped out his cell phone and hopped along. And I thought, there you are, that's exactly what I think Tina was talking about. There are people, you have to look at where they're coming from. There are keyboard warriors who will hop on Twitter, and you can't win for losing. You on either side, they're going to accuse you of not fairly reporting a story because they want to argue with someone. But I think that we're put in a special position, being a Fox station, where a lot of people confuse us with Fox News Channel. When I first came here, we had people picketing on the front lawn at 100 East Spear, saying that they wanted to speak with Bill O'Reilly. Now, this was back when I first came here. So we still have that kind of that dynamic a little bit, but you would think that would grant more favor with those then who support Fox News Channel. but not necessarily. We have people who will come after us and say that we don't show enough support for the president. We'll have other people come out and say that we slant more toward the president, where it's just, where they're coming from, how they're saying it. I've had soccer moms at Wash Park scream at us because we jumped out of a live truck that said Fox 31. Scream across the whole park at us. So it's just, I think we're kind of there. And if somebody, what's the saying, guys? If you are running around with a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
I didn't even, thanks for bringing that up. I feel like sometimes I see the news director or something say like, oh, somebody called in again and, thought that we were Fox News. You are not owned by News Corporation. I believe Nexstar, is that who owns
Yes,
KDVR?
we're owned by Nexstar now. We've been owned by different companies, but when we first, when that building opened its doors for the very first time, we were a Fox O&O station. But that still didn't make us at that point part of Fox News Channel. But so there's just an interesting dynamic that goes on there as far as the image.
So the last question I want to ask in our final minutes is there a go-to question that you just always ask? No matter the interview, is it the classic, do you have anything else to add? I don't know how any of you feel about that, but is there just a go-to question that you always or usually ask any interviewee or subject?
It's a little one size fits all for me. So that's a little too, yeah, no, not for me.
I mean, I think, do you have anything else to add is a good question. I mean, it's an important question to add because they may have had something that's burning that they just really want to talk about and you just didn't ask. Or, so another way of saying that is there something I should have asked you? I think those are go-to questions. Those are go-to questions for me.
Have you ever had a memorable, and I realize I'm asking you sort of on the spot, Tina, but have you ever had a memorable answer to that question where you're like, oh my gosh, this completely changed the entire, focal point of the interview based on what this person said?
I'm sure I have, because I've done like a gajillion interviews. But, nothing is springing to mind right away.
I put you on the spot.
Yeah. Well, let me think if something brilliant comes to me.
I do find that that question often gets someone to summarize what they've been talking about for the last however many minutes. And I think that can often be very helpful because they'll give kind of their general sentiment to what we've been talking about. And maybe that came through in like 9 different quotes earlier, but getting someone to say it all in one place can be very helpful. I always ask it. I also, depending on the story, but I always ask who else should I be talking to about this, or who else is a good person who could lend some insight on this. Obviously, it depends on what you're dealing with. The police department's not going to give you sources for who else you should talk to, but for a lot of other stories, people have some good answers that you might not know.
So I will, something else that did come to me, it's not really a question, but it is, particularly if somebody's given a long answer or a complicated answer or fraught answer, I will restate. I'll say, so this is what I'm hearing you say. And then that gives them a chance to clarify if clarification is needed, or to elaborate and maybe even say something deeper. That's a go-to for me.
I'm sure many of you get requests to have like show me the story ahead of time, or can you send me the video before it airs, or can you give me the interview? How do you graciously handle those requests?
Well, there's a very clear answer and reason, and good reason for that. There are legal reasons that we do not provide people with raw footage and stuff like that. But what's wonderful about today's world is the advent of the website, the link. So I just let them know, listen, I'm not going to be home from work in time to see the story. I'll miss it. No, I will personally send you a link. It will appear on our website, and I just send them a link and watch it at your convenience. Show family and friends, share the link. That's just a great way to handle that, to reassure them. And as far as that go-to question, by the way, one thing that we do or one thing that I like to do, at least, in the field with a lot of folks, is say, you see this camera? Everybody in this whole area, plus this is going to be online, so you could count the entire world, will be listening to you. This is your moment. What is it you want everybody to know if it's the last thing they think of before their head hits the pillow tonight? And then they're like, they seize the moment, and it all comes out. It's just,
It's a great question.
It's like what I say to myself, okay, I can't make a decision about this. Okay, you got 5 seconds. You'll win $1 million if you make a decision. I make a decision. It's like, it's just the way the brain works.
Great. Well, I do want to circle back to Susanna's question, Ryan, just for you. She asks, and I'm sorry I missed this, do you read all the books or does your team read them and frame the questions for you? How do you approach your voracious book reading?
I read most of the books. There's a very cool poet called Khadijah Queen who's coming on. In this case, my producer has flagged like 8 poems that I'll read ahead of time. So I'm not reading everything in that case. But for the most part, people say, what do you read for fun? What do you read? And I say, I don't, there's no recreational reading for me. It's all work reading. So am I the only one who wants to see more of Shaul Turner's hutch behind her? This thing looks so beautiful.
Oh!
It's so gorgeous. Okay. Sorry.
I did it myself. You wouldn't believe how cheap it was.
We'll have to score everybody's backgrounds.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I was going to say, I think Shaul wins.
Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate all of your time. I know you're incredibly busy and generous. This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you for being so open on this. To our attendees, thank you for your great questions. We will be posting this to our YouTube channel for those of you who weren't able to watch it or maybe came in midway. And just a reminder, I'm Dan Petty, president of the Denver Press Club. We are a membership supported organization. So you can help support programming like this, support our historic building, which fingers crossed, we hope we're going to be able to maybe open in September in a very limited capacity by joining us at denverpressclub.org/membership. We also are doing our big fundraiser, the Damon Runyon Award Banquet, where we will be honoring Judy Woodruff on September 12th. Tickets still available. Also, unfortunately, via Zoom, but the great thing is, of course, you can enjoy it from the comfort of your own home. So again, I just want to thank Tina, Sam, Shaul, Ryan, thank you so much for your time. I hope we get to do something like this again. And to everybody, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.